One of the most frustrating things I know is lack of communication. If there is no clear line of dialogue between me and someone else, any attempts at cooperation, at bridge building, or even having a good time together becomes so much more difficult. If I'm constantly forced to try to decode the other's behaviors and second-guessing their decisions, I won't be having a good time. Something as simple as having a difference of expectations can really quickly send a situation spiraling until neither of you have any idea what's going on. And to put it into more concrete, relatable terms, if you don't have a session 0 where you can clearly establish expectations and boundaries and goals, chances are pretty high that friction is going to occur when you sit down at a table full of unfamiliar people to play a game of Vampire the Masquerade. Sadly, lack of communication is one of the most glaring flaws of Vampire the Masquerade Swansong. Now, don't get me wrong, this is clearly a game that people have put hours upon hours of hard work into, and some of the environments, the characters, and music, they're truly enjoyable. At its best, the game had me taking notes and mapping out character relationships and genuinely feeling like I was being introduced to a fleshed out, well-established court of the Camarilla, with all the intrigue it would offer. But sadly, those notes ultimately didn't do me much good, and all the game's better aspects are overshadowed by frustrating busywork, a ruthless and arbitrary point distribution system, and a world that punishes you severely for daring to want to use the powers that make you a vampire. In the game of Swansong, you're better off never wasting your blood exploring or trying alternative routes unless you're absolutely certain you will get a return on your investments, which is practically impossible to do on your first playthrough of the game. To put it bluntly, Swansong is the tabletop equivalent of a storyteller letting his group create whatever characters they want and stepping out of the room while they distribute their points, only to then plop them down in the middle of a Sabbat incursion and shaking his head when none of them picked firearms or potens. This review will be divided into 3 parts. The first part being a general overview of the game without delving into spoilers, where I discuss the game's engine, the basic premise, and how the system works. The second part will contain spoilers, and I will discuss some of the things I enjoyed and really didn't like about the game's story and characters. And the third part finally will be a summary of my overall thoughts. Spoiler, they're not great. Swansong is for the most part visually very impressive. There is a lot of thought and effort put into creating a realistic lived-in environment littered with everything from pizza cartons to bottles of wine and, of course, stains of blood. There is a strong sense of visual narrative and thought put into navigating the grimy underbelly of Boston, and whether you're in the basement of a bar geared towards kindred, or a makeshift office for a coterie of hackers, it does give the impression that people have been conducting their daily or nightly affairs there. There are great uses of shadows in the game as well, and the visual effects of activating your disciplines really impacts the way you see things. Sometimes when I would turn off my auspex, I would be caught off guard by how different and colorful everything looked without that film over my eyes. There's also an almost ridiculous amount of environmental notes that are meant to help with world building. These range from passive-aggressive email sniping between colleagues to surveillance reports tucked away in a secret compartment. Unfortunately, due to reasons I will discuss later, these became less and less enjoyable to read as the game progressed. As for the models of the game, they certainly are a mixed bag. For the majority of the time, the models themselves are fine, even if people familiar with the Council, Big Bad Wolf's previous game, will quickly recognize the usage of masks of all sorts to cover the faces of less important NPCs in order to save time on modeling different faces. Even so, I can swear I saw a couple of repeated visages during my gameplay, which honestly I don't have much of a problem with, as I don't think they were voiced by the same actors. All that being said, some models look almost half finished, and there are several cases of weird lighting going on, one of the most jarring being the Prince's mouth, looking like she drank a bottle of ink before the game began, while other characters have shining pearly whites. Hair, likewise, is a bit of a hit and miss, and sometimes there's an almost unnatural luster that makes it seem greasy and, gross. Facial animations are very basic in this game and felt at times almost embarrassingly rigid and lifeless, especially for important characters that were barely emoting for most of the time, even during intense parts of the dialogue. Combine that with some truly horrendous movement animations, not to mention canned shrug animations used all the time, and not even the decent voice work could bring life to a lot of these characters. And that's not counting the plethora of visual glitches I encountered in the game, including NPCs walking through furniture, hair defying the laws of gravity, T-posing in the Boston Codex of characters, and sudden janky snaps in animation. All this said, as a fan of Bloodlines, these things don't dissuade me much from the game. In fact, I appreciate the length the artist went to make a diverse cast, not just in the case of sex and ethnicity, but also in body types. That actually helped immensely in terms of immersion, and I can appreciate the work that went into it. The audio for the game is fairly decent, even if the voice acting might be a bit stilted at times. There's not a whole range of emotions expressed through the game, and barely any of the voices come near the memorability of, for example, LaCroix or Therese and Jeanette Vorman. Two characters in particular stood out to me, those being the daughter of one of the game's protagonists, whose lisp and childlike voice immediately rubbed me the wrong way, and a Nosferatu who spoke in a way that made me fear for his vocal folds, especially the longer line deliveries were almost painful to listen to, but not nearly as painful as this missed opportunity to a joke.
Under the current circumstances, I can't really go poking my nose in her business.
I've always enjoyed the idea of children as kindred. There are very few of them in Vampire the Masquerade, Nikolai of Chicago fame being one of them, and I would have enjoyed the dissonance of an adult plotting mind in the body of a child, which to me would have given the good counterbalance to her otherwise saccharine childish behavior, something she put up for the other adults to underestimate her, perhaps. The music of the game is decent as well, with some really good tunes mixed in. It's never intrusive, and it can swell up dramatically when it needs to, but it sadly does not provide songs that I will remember, even if that's not necessarily a bad thing. It clearly gets the job done. Some of the sound mixing is done fairly sloppily, sadly, and one of the most glaring mistakes being how a voice is seemingly muted if the camera isn't locked onto a character, or how entire segments of voice acting are just plain missing from the game, which makes the lack of fast forwarding, which we'll get into in a bit, believe you me, even more frustrating.
Is that a problem?
I mentioned previously some of the world-building notes being a little bit too much, and this is a pet peeve of mine, but there are so many unnecessary documents littering this world. There are countless reports with dates and times and names, none of which have any relevance to the actual puzzle solving in the game. And while that does make the world seem a little bit more realistic, it also makes me wonder, what was the point of writing all that? Were the writers finished really early and had nothing to do? Were they writing more stuff just to, keep themselves busy? I feel like it was not really a great choice to have all those documents lying around, especially since when you're trying to solve puzzles, you find yourself constantly backtracking to these documents trying to see if you missed something. Finally, I think the usage of disciplines in general is interesting. I really like the versatility of Obfuscate and Auspex, disciplines that permit you to bypass many challenges in the game, and sometimes also earn an extra bit of exposition or plot hints. Tracing fragrances through the air of a murder scene, or watching a renowned hacker struggle to remember his own unnecessarily convoluted password are great little pieces of world building that I enjoyed. The gameplay itself is more or less entirely non-combat oriented. You invest points in social skills of various kinds, skills in electronics and lockpicking, or skills of knowledge about the world you live in and topics of higher education and occult matters. You can also invest your XP into expanding your repertoire of disciplines, which stretch so far that I'm really wondering if anyone actually ever filled one of those trees. Your skills can either be checked with a flat pass, like for example if your 300-year-old vampire can recognize a childishly simple Latin quote, or it can be done at a cost of willpower, one of your resources, in situations where you are trying to hack a computer or convince someone to let you murder their friends. In social interaction, you often have the chance to invest more willpower to boost your chance of success as well, which, let me tell you, is something you will have to do a lot in this game. This seemingly simple system is unfortunately one of the worst aspects of the game. You have absolutely no chance of knowing what skills will come into play in the scenes you're going to be facing, and you are prompted to invest your points before you start it. Skills start out kind of cheap, but very rapidly skyrocket in cost, and one would then think that maybe buying a range of skills at a lower level is better. Alas, this is not the case. Most of the NPCs you interact with, especially the kindred, have ridiculously high stats, and they have the possibility to boost their stats as well, presented as a percentage chance of them raising it by one level. If you both have the same score at the end of the challenge, a dice roll decides who is the winner. Now, that might not seem so bad when you hear it like this, and it does seem quite difficult to permanently die in this game, at least until I provoked the game into killing me close by the end because I had lost any and all care I had for the character I was playing, but there is a couple more unfortunate elements to this. You are rewarded experience through your successes in this game. The more things you achieve, the more XP you are rewarded. But what actually counts as a success feels rather arbitrary, and you can't really tell until the level is over, which makes it difficult to know what skills to actually focus on. That, coupled with the fact that you can't quick save or quick load in this game, nor can you skip dialogue, at least until you replay the level later, means that if you have progressed far into a level, only to lose a confrontation with another character, a confrontation by the way is a multi-step challenge of different skills against an NPC, you might feel inclined to reset. But if you do, you will have to play the whole level over again, without the ability to skip any of the dialogue. It took me roughly 2 hours of playing before I completely gave up on any hope I had to actually finish the game and feel good about my successes. I invested large amounts of XP into skills that were never checked. I bought the second level of celerity, which I used a grand total of once, and it granted me a completely useless hint that caused me more confusion than help, and not even on the same level I bought it. And neither technology nor security seemed particularly useful, except for the autocation. They were practically the only way I could solve a situation after a series of very unfortunate fuck-ups. I mentioned previously the resources of willpower, the second being your hunger. Every single challenge involving discipline or skill requires expenditure of points, and you have no idea if this Auspix flashback is going to give you a crucial bit of information, provide some cool but irrelevant world building, or worse, give you exactly the same information you found in a note in a desk drawer just now. Unless you're somewhat clairvoyant, you have no way of knowing whether this investment of blood or willpower will pay off. And one of the absolute dumbest of these was when I was given the option of jumping across a fence, costing me a sizable amount of blood in the process. I ended up in a location that I could walk to without issue, meaning I had wasted the 4 hunger for a shortcut that I never needed to use again. And to illustrate this, that's a third of all the hunger you can have. I was able to listen to a violin rendition of the Swansong for 2 hunger as well, in the form of an Auspix memory, which was another absolutely pointless expenditure of hunger for no reason or gain. But it's not over yet. You can also become more suspicious, causing NPCs to increase their difficulty against you in pretty much every interaction. For example, if you feed on a rat in a sewer, apparently all enemies of you and your kind in the entire city will realize this, and your level of suspicion will increase, and this is across all 3 playable characters. At one point in the game you find yourself almost forced to feed on rats, and that somehow makes you more suspicious when you are in an alternative dimension. We'll get to that later. This means that the future challenges in certain skills will keep increasing in difficulty over time, and unless you know beforehand which times you should use your disciplines, if, say, there's a juicy XP reward from doing it, you're almost better off never using your blood. There are items to restore both willpower and blood, but the former can sometimes be in a ridiculously short supply, and the latter will draw more attention to you unless you take a swig from a Tremere brand hip flask, which I found a total of 3 of through the entire game. The end result of this is a system where you either accept failure on tests you don't know how important they are, because you either lack the appropriate skill or you don't want to invest the willpower to boost your chance of success, sometimes even at a risk of failure, or you end up facing challenges later in the scene with both your vitae and willpower depleted and you have no option but to accept defeat then. Rarely do I feel like a game is actively trying to make me fail, but the amount of times I felt screwed over because of me arbitrarily picking the wrong skill to level up is astounding. Even when I thought I was going to accomplish something great, the game either undermined the achievement or threw me a curveball that sent me off course again. You're also often forced into confrontations with NPCs where you barely have any idea what their motivations are, making it exceedingly hard to predict what lines to deliver to make them calm down. Sometimes there are up to 5 or 6 dialogue options, sometimes there are only 3, and sometimes you can reply and earn yourself a success without using a skill, sometimes you need to have mastered a skill to succeed. This, again, is completely arbitrary. Confrontations are messed up in this game, and easily my least favorite part, because due to me unwittingly investing in the wrong skills, I locked myself out of what I assume is a large plot important exposition because they put a skill check at the end of the confrontation that I couldn't match and that I have to succeed at to actually succeed with the confrontation. And the last stage of a confrontation is repeated until you pass or fail. Fun! There is a kind of almost sadistic glee in this game where it puts you in a situation that you're doomed to fail, like a storyteller who thinks it's more fun to watch you squirm than to tell you a good story. And nowhere is this as obvious as it is with Caleb, the 300-year-old Ventru getting outsmarted by his own child and fumbling his way through things. He's supposedly the Mr. Fix-It of the local Camarilla, an efficient murder machine with unquestionable loyalty to the Ivory Tower. Yet by the end of the game, I was wondering how incompetent the rest of the city must be if this guy was their top agent. To reiterate something I said in the beginning of this review, in the game of Swansong, you're better off never wasting your blood exploring or trying alternative routes unless you're absolutely certain you will get a return on your investments, which is practically impossible to do on the first playthrough of the game. I cannot stress enough how heavy my own playthrough of the game was impacted by this. I seemingly made every wrong decision when distributing my points, and after I finished my absolute favorite level of the game, the part where you investigate the crashed party, I swore not to restart a single level if I screwed up or missed something obvious because I didn't want to waste any more time. The reason for that? The unskippable dialogues. I feel like I need to emphasize this part again and again. There is no way to skip dialogue until you play a level after you've beaten it, and there is no form of quick save or checkpoints. If you screw up while playing, you either accept it or you reload the entire level, meaning long stretches of cutscenes and dialogue to sit through. Was this a decision made to pad out the playtime, to show off the voice acting, or to make sure players didn't miss any plot-relevant points? Well, that might have been it because there's hardly anything to help you keep track of all the notes and thoughts you might have in-game. The quest button gives you a helpful one line of description of what you need to do, which sometimes isn't nearly enough for you to move on. And as the final cherry on top of this, at the end of each chapter you get a rundown of all the things you could have done and all the things you screwed up on, just in case you were feeling particularly good about your performance. And with that out of the way, I think it's time we go on to the plot part. This will be full of spoilers, so if you would rather not get the story ruined for you, go ahead to the timestamp across the screen and you'll be at a summary of this review. The game has 3 protagonists, which, while on paper seems like a good idea, in practice it really wasn't. You have no real choice in who you play, at most only the order in which you play them, and they all have separate stats and missions. So it's basically 3 different stories. This would have been acceptable if their actions had some kind of impact on the others, but even when I found information as Leisha that Caleb would very much want to know, it never really became an option to hand them over, which kind of baffled me. You are not playing a coterie of kindred in this game, by the way, you are playing 3 lone wolves with really unclear motivations. Out of all the 3, I think I only really enjoyed playing as Leisha, due to her competence at infiltration and her struggles with her prophetic visions. Caleb had the best designed levels, but he was also dull and boring to play, and an incredibly poor fit for the job. 300 years and he feels like a puppet being pulled around with close to zero motivation at all. His poor relationship with his child is barely explored, at least in the parts that I saw, and when I was given the option of forgiving the money-hungry corrupt sugar baron in the prison of the Second Inquisition, and how did he even end up there? What the hell was he doing? He knew the SI was coming to the Red Salon. I chose to let him rot. Hey Beryl, you want a piece of advice? Don't tell me you embraced my potential child and mocked me for it if you're expecting me to help you. Caleb's crowning moment was the investigation of Jason Moore's apartment. This, together with the investigation of the attacked reunification party, were the two most engaging levels for me, but sadly they were nowhere near enough to carry the game. The investigations of these two crime scenes show that there was a genuine passion in creating realistic puzzles that sometimes offered multiple solutions. Something that unfortunately soured the whole experience for me in Moore's apartment was how I had saved my blood as much as I could and had zero hunger by the time I was to escort him out of the building. As if on cue, a swarm of police officers pulled their weapons on me for escorting out a guy that for all intents and purposes was the thought dead victim of a murder, ergo, not a criminal. They had no reason to react the way they did, especially thinking I was an FBI agent, but I employed my disciplines against them, sure that my Spartan use of blood up until now would have been fine. Except it wasn't, and as I was shoved into more and more absurd situations, all under pressure of time, I ended up draining more in the elevator in what is quite possibly the most underwhelming frenzy I have ever seen in a vampire game. Absolutely terrible! And another example of the game punishing you for not understanding the arbitrary it decided on without letting you in on the secret. I tried to like, but she felt so poorly written it was almost impossible. She had close to zero reaction to anything happening to her, including getting thrown into a mindfuck dungeon by the Tremere for literally no reason. When they apologized to her, she just moved on with her life, and then forgot the last 30 years with her sire, a plot point that came just about as quickly as it disappeared, was extra ridiculous. The Tremere intended to keep her imprisoned there, all based on a misunderstanding, and everyone was seemingly okay with this? Did I miss something? The dungeon also had an absolutely infuriating elevator puzzle that came across as nothing more than filler to pad out the playtime. Maybe I missed some alternative solution to this, sketched down upon a neonate's writing pad, but I ended up spending well over half an hour fiddling around with these puzzles, all so I could miss the Nosferatu on the 4th floor, because the little point of no return icons weren't enough for my thick head to take pause and not skip ahead. You might think then that the Tremere Chantry, which by the way had excellent environmental design, truly top notch, was a bad level, but don't worry. Her next mission, convincing the Anarchs to sacrifice themselves against the Second Inquisition, made even less sense, especially since the end product of that felt completely underutilized and only really showed MM's barely emoting face, expressing the slightest twinge of regret as her friends were gunned down while she was crawling in ventilation shafts dreaming of being Primogen. Which, hold on, let me take a step back there. That's 2 missions out of 2 where MM just starts pulling territorial rights out of her ass to save her disastrous attempts at diplomacy. Even she admits that she's just making shit up, and last time I checked, those decisions were entirely within the domain of the prince, unless MM herself owned those areas to do with as she pleased. MM also has one of the most annoying character traits of a game character, and that is to complain about pointless time-wasting bullshit, only highlighting even more exactly how pointless it is. Thank you, MM, I don't need to know that all this busy work is meant to keep me from having fun. Now don't get me wrong, I couldn't care less about Leisha and her daughter's plotline either. I never liked children in games, especially not when they are supposed to represent something innocent or it's about parental relationships. It didn't help that I botched the one attempt to learn more about who I truly am, once again due to the developers putting a, for me, impossible skill check at the very end of the confrontation. But even before that, I wasted no time drinking the concoction that would help me get rid of my brain ghosts. Even so, Leisha's gameplay is some of my favorite, infiltrating groups and trying to solve puzzles while pretending to be one of them. Figuring out which uniform to copy, making sure not to waste too much blood, and also employing your more human skills work really well in tandem. But sadly, Leisha herself was not an interesting character to me, and certainly not helped by how much of her background I didn't get to see because the game didn't think I was good enough for it. Halsey was more of an annoyance than anything else, although I did allow her some feedback into my confrontation with my psychiatrist, which actually helped me win. There's a hint of a twist later on, but like I said, I didn't pass the test, so the game closed the door on me for that part of the story. I don't have much else to say about Leisha other than that I allowed the werewolf in the end of the game to kill me, because I had long since hit a point of the game where I just wanted it to be over. I never felt that I was being propelled forward through the plot, but rather dragged behind a dog sled and hitting my face on every skill check coming my way, the sled relentlessly pulling my broken and battered body along. And I think that's the crux of this entire game. I don't know if it was because I didn't play it right, or if it was poor luck, or if it was done out of some misguided attempt at providing replayability, but if the first time through the game causes this amount of grief and frustration, I consider it more of a deterrent than anything else. Ironically, I felt more for the Society of St. Leopold than any of the kindred in this game, because no matter how much the narrative paints them up to be faceless mooks and baddies, these guys are still trying to save humanity from a parasitic species at the risk of their own lives. And when my final confrontation with a man who genuinely believes in the power and goodness of God comes along, I've killed enough innocent human beings without any kind of consequence in the story that I couldn't even bring myself to care if Caleb died or not. Fine, I thought as he began smoking, bursting into flames. He deserves it. We all deserve it. Fuck all these vampires, they're terrible people. Vampire the Masquerade Swansong was too ambitious. There's very little else I can say that can sum up the entire experience. You could have stuck to one protagonist, you could have cut the cast in half, and you could have truncated or even removed some levels entirely. The entire harbor section served so little purpose, it hurts to think about how much time must have been spent on creating it. And the pacing of the game utterly breaks down by the last third, where it simultaneously hits the gas and pulls the handbrake, creating an experience that demands you keep your cool all the while it is blowing an air horn straight into your ear. It is a game that at its core has a great idea for a story, but it doesn't want to give it to you unless you play by its very specific rules, and it's willing to cut large parts of its plot out to make sure you understand this. Every piece of freedom comes with 3 pitfalls, and it is like the designers heard the word handholdy and decided to make their game the antithesis of that. I tend not to focus on bad aspects of games. In fact, I prefer lifting the positive aspects of something over the negative, but this game felt like it was out to personally slight me, and the amount of times I cursed and yelled at my screen when things felt not only unfair, but completely stacked against me were too many to count. It's fine if a game doesn't reveal all of its secrets on the first playthrough. In fact, I welcome the chance to play through it the optimal way. Like in Werewolf Heart of the Forest, there's many different routes to take. But when the first time playing this game is as miserable as it was for me, it is very difficult to find a motivation to get back in there again. Can I recommend this game? Maybe. It is still a good story, and it serves a good inspiration for any attentive storyteller. The amount of work put into writing the backstory of all the characters of this game, of building a functioning city of kindred, and of presenting the overwhelming threat the SI represents should not be ignored. Many people put a lot of hard work into this, and if nothing else, it presents a very interesting perspective of a city of kindred post-London. Ultimately, I'm glad I played this game, because it evoked emotions in me. It left me thinking what I would have done differently, what I enjoyed, and what I hated. I much prefer a flawed game like this to an altogether palatable but forgettable experience. But I am glad I am done with this game. I'm also very angry that I played this game, but that's mostly because of the lack of dialogue skip. Seriously, it's 2022. There's no excuse.